The film opens with our protagonist, a dentist named Elizabeth Hall, inspecting her patient's mouth and giving him some advice about flossing. She tells her assistant, Denise, to contact Dr. Belling, her fiancé. The patient asks her about how she and Dr. Belling met, so she tells him their love story. The patient asks Elizabeth where she plans to spend their honeymoon, but Elizabeth tells him that going away is not something that she and her fiancé would usually do. On another side of the office, George Belling greets Denise and thanks her for her work. Elizabeth meets up with them as she prepares to leave with George. We find out that the couple is going to visit George's family. However, they will be too busy planning for the wedding to consider the trip a vacation. Outside the office, Elizabeth and George go over a few minor changes in their schedule before going their separate paths for the day. In the next scene, we see Elizabeth talking to her friend, Abby, about her upcoming trip. They briefly talk about George's brother, David, a person who travels a lot and constantly sends postcards to his family. Abby asks Elizabeth if she's interested in an adventurous lifestyle. We then find out that Elizabeth used to dream of traveling across Europe, but changed her mind as she grew older. She has her dental practice to worry about, and George doesn't like to travel. The next day, we see the couple preparing for their trip. Elizabeth tells George that her patient told her about their 6-week honeymoon in South America. She asks him if he's interested in doing the same. George thinks doing such a thing is exhausting, and insists that they can't leave work for 6 weeks, because they have patients to take care of. Elizabeth is obviously disappointed by his response, but she just agrees with him. When the couple arrives at their destination, they stop by a restaurant that has a unique offer. If a customer finishes a platter of oysters, they get a free pie. Elizabeth thinks the place is fun, but George looks like he is uncomfortable. After ordering some drinks, the two decide to leave. In the next scene, the couple finally arrives at their destination. George receives a call from the office, but Elizabeth convinces him to ignore it in the meantime. George enters the house first and greets his sister, Louise. Elizabeth greets Louise and her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Diana. George receives another phone call, and this time he decides to answer it. Diana sees Elizabeth's list and comments about how she has never met a person as organized as Elizabeth. We see Louise leave the house to pick up her brother David from the airport. Elizabeth is surprised by this. Diana mentions her son is arriving early for the surprise party she wasn't supposed to know about. She then reassures Elizabeth that there's no need to worry, because she can still act surprised. Later that night, Elizabeth and George reminisce about the experiences they had during childhood. She remembers very specific details, while George barely remembers any. When she brings up the fun scavenger hunt activities they did back then, George expresses his distaste for it. She suggests reliving those moments, but George thinks adults shouldn't be doing those things anymore. Elizabeth sees the treehouse that George's father built, and is amazed that it's still intact. George goes quiet. He opens up about how he wishes his father was still alive, to see what he's done with his career. Elizabeth reassures him that his father would surely be proud of him. The next day, Elizabeth converses with Louise. They briefly talk about David. Louise mentions that David might not stay for long there, since he is a wanderer looking for his next big adventure. Moments later, a deliveryman named Eugene arrives to deliver a parcel for Louise. He tries asking her out to go see a band, but Louise insists that she is busy. After Eugene leaves, Elizabeth tells Louise that the delivery man likes her, suggesting he might be her soulmate. Louise makes up a silly reason why she can't date him, and they eventually drop the topic altogether. In the next scene, we see Elizabeth going to a store to pick up some ice cream for Diana's surprise party. When she enters the store, she tells the employee a complicated order and gives him a detailed list of her orders. David comes up behind her and orders an ice cream for himself. He and Elizabeth awkwardly greet each other. David congratulates her for getting engaged to his brother and asks her how George proposed. She tells him an unimpressive proposal story, then asks him how long he'll be staying. David reveals that he won't stay for long, since he needs to go back to Mumbai to teach his students. When David tries to pay for his ice cream, he brings out bills that are currencies from different countries. Elizabeth ends up paying for both of their orders. Elizabeth notices the rabbit's foot on the counter and asks David if that's his lucky charm. He reveals that the item actually belongs to her, from way back in middle school. David tells her a story about when they went to the theater when they were 12. According to him, Elizabeth reported him to the usher for speaking during the movie. While he was dealing with security, the rabbit's foot fell off Elizabeth's bag, and he kept it ever since. Elizabeth apologizes, and they leave the store together. Outside, Elizabeth tells David that he used to do a lot of things that annoyed her. He offers that now could be the perfect opportunity to let it all out and tell him about all those moments. Elizabeth obliges enthusiastically. After she finishes and catches a breath, David tells her to let go of those grievances, and that they'll meet each other later. Later that day, the house is full of guests waiting for Diana to arrive. When Diana enters the house, everyone jumps out, and she dutifully acts surprised. Louise immediately notices the act and realizes that someone already told Diana about the surprise. Elizabeth tries to admit that it was her, but David speaks up to take the blame. Elizabeth is touched, trying to tell him he didn't need to take the fall for her, but he just ignores the comment and walks away. During the celebration, Diana takes time to talk about how proud she is of her children. She mentions George and his engagement to Elizabeth. During the speech, George receives a call and goes to take it. Diana also mentions Louise, who is an award-winning artist. Then she mentions David, who travels the world, teaching children in need. Their grandmother Vivian interrupts the speech and talks about her opinion. She thinks that David should stay in one place and get married, just like George. David responds by playfully telling his grandma that he can't find anyone as special as her. She advises him that love is something that will find him when he least expects it. Elizabeth goes to George and asks him what the call was about. He tells her that a client called, and he needs to go to the office. Elizabeth tries to convince him to stay, but George insists that the client is only comfortable if he is the one doing the procedure. She doesn't argue further, and George prepares to leave. When George steps out of the house, he meets his brother. David tells him to be careful, since the weather is turning bad. David also tries to make small talk with his brother, telling George that he read his article, and that he thinks it's great. George accepts the compliment, admitting to David that he wishes he was as adventurous and spontaneous as him. David offers to take him on an impromptu trip, but George declines, too stuck in his own head to consider such a thing. He then gets in his car and drives away. At 2 in the morning, Elizabeth is woken up by loud music coming from downstairs. When she checks the source of the noise, she sees David in the kitchen, eating cake and listening to a rock song. She scolds him, but he dismisses her concern. Instead of apologizing, he offers her a glass of milk and a slice of cake. She follows him to the living room, telling him that she doesn't want to dance to loud music or eat peanut butter cake. David then pretends to have an allergy attack and falls to the floor. When Elizabeth realizes his prank, she becomes agitated and tells him how annoyed she is. Flustered, she tells him that they should ignore each other until the end of the engagement party. On the following day, George tries to return, but the bridge is blocked by a construction crew. He finds out that lightning struck the bridge and that it will take 3 to 4 days before it is repaired. This means that he will not be able to attend the appointments with Elizabeth. He tries to contain his frustration. Back at the Belling residence, David joins Elizabeth for coffee, but pretends to not see her. Suddenly, Elizabeth receives a call from George. She can barely hear what her fiancé is saying due to bad reception. Fortunately, she is able to decipher from a few words that the bridge is closed due to a lightning strike. After the call ends, she asks David why he didn't tell her about the incident at the bridge. He responds only by reminding her that she told him not to talk to her. Later that day, we see Elizabeth walking alone, heading towards her appointment. David drives by and asks her if she needs a ride. She refuses at first, but David tells her that they should call a truce for George's sake. She agrees to let him drive her to her appointments, under the condition that he stays quiet at their destination. They arrive at the location, and we see Elizabeth talking to one of the employees, describing her ideal wedding cake design. David breaks his promise and enters the premises. Elizabeth reminds her that he shouldn't interrupt her. Then she talks to the employee again, telling her that all her cakes need to be vanilla flavored. David makes a comment about it, but Elizabeth snaps back, reminding him that she gets to decide what to do with her own wedding cake. David tells Elizabeth that he thinks that she is a girl that's capable of enjoying more than the basic flavors. Despite his attempt to convince her, Elizabeth still chooses vanilla for her wedding cake. On their way to the next appointment, Elizabeth asks David if he thinks she is dull. David tells her that some people need to hold the fort, so people like him can do whatever they want. Elizabeth reveals that she sometimes thinks about going out of her comfort zone at times. Out of the blue, David turns the car around and takes Elizabeth to the restaurant we previously saw earlier in the movie. David orders a platter of oysters and tells Elizabeth they are going to finish it so she can have a pie at the end. At first, she dislikes the taste of the oyster, but eventually, they finish the platter. A slice of pie is served on the table, and Elizabeth indulges herself with a bite. Some cream gets stuck on her upper lip, and David wipes it off with his thumb. David admits that he can't believe she and George are actually getting married. Elizabeth then asks him if he ever thought about marrying and starting a family. He says that he's never been in one place for long enough to consider such things. A few moments later, David heads off to go and dance. He urges her to join him on the dance floor. While dancing, Elizabeth receives a call from George, but David persuades her to not answer the call, since she can always contact him later. They continue dancing the night away. The next day, we see Eugene visiting Louise while she's finishing a painting. He gives her a ceramic duck as a gift, and then leaves afterward. Louise looks at the gift, and she can't help but smile. Meanwhile, we see Elizabeth meeting up with Grandma Vivian to deliver some food that Diana made. Vivian invites Elizabeth inside for some tea. The grandmother tells Elizabeth that she thinks George is being an idiot for leaving his fiancé alone to take care of the wedding preparations. Grandma Vivian tells Elizabeth the story of how she met her husband. She mentions how Grandpa Lou had an opposite personality to hers, yet they made the relationship work. She describes a feeling she likes to call zing, a special connection that's hard to deny. Grandma Vivian confesses that she thinks David and Elizabeth have zing. When Elizabeth corrects her, reminding her it's George she's engaged to, Vivian pretends as if she said it right the first time. Back in the living room, Elizabeth and David meet again and have a conversation. They reminisce about their favorite childhood memories. Elizabeth asks him if he feels like there is a part of him that's missing whenever he is traveling to faraway places. David admits that sometimes he misses home and wishes that he could go back and spend time with the people he loves and left behind. David grabs a book and takes out a piece of paper. It's a list of places Elizabeth wanted to go when she was young. She is amazed that David found such a list. He asks her earnestly if she ever ended up going to those places, already knowing the answer. He suggests that maybe Elizabeth has a part of her that's missing too, a part that was present when she wrote that list. After a brief pause, Elizabeth tells David that he needs to call George, and the conversation ends there. In the next scene, we see Louise talking with David. She mentions how David brings out a different side of Elizabeth whenever he is with her. She tells him how happy she is that he is finally getting along with her. Louise also brings up zing, stating that it's something that David and Elizabeth might share. David corrects her, saying that he doesn't have that type of connection with anybody. Later that night, we see Elizabeth and Louise cleaning some wine glasses. Eugene arrives to deliver a few letters. Elizabeth tells Louise to give some coffee to the mailman. She also urges her to serve Eugene a slice of pie. Eugene loves it, and seeing how the atmosphere is getting romantic, Elizabeth leaves the two to talk. Outside, Elizabeth is having a phone conversation with George. He tells her a story that he thinks is funny, and she pretends to be entertained by it. After a while, their conversation is cut off by poor reception once again. Later, Elizabeth finds David inside the recreational room, watching a movie. She sits down on the couch beside him. Elizabeth reveals that there is a dating show she's been waiting to see, so they change the channel. While watching, David comments on how the show is not portraying real romance. Elizabeth challenges him and asks him how he would romance the girl on the show if he was the guy on TV. David looks Elizabeth in the eye and delivers a moving romantic line. He delivers it in such a serious way that it feels like he is directly saying it to Elizabeth. The next day, Elizabeth sees David playing a guitar in the treehouse. She asks him to drive her to town again, because she has a couple of appointments. They go to a wedding gift registry to pick out some gifts that the wedding guests can buy. David finds this to be a ridiculous idea. Elizabeth scans the pile of plates near her, saying that it's an example of a perfect gift. David points to a golden flying pig figurine on the wall, and cracks a joke about it being the perfect gift. David then tells Elizabeth about how, back then, she used to find joy in the little things in life. Elizabeth tells him that it was a long time ago, when she still believed in unicorns. She insists that people change. Moments later, we see Elizabeth standing in front of a pile of toasters. She suddenly tells David that she changed her mind, and wants to scan things that are not on her list. She wants to prove to David that she still finds joy in the little things in life. She then scans a random toaster in front of her and laughs. Afterward, David encourages her to scan random items, for the sake of having fun. She goes from one area to another, scanning items that have no practical purpose, but look intriguing. At one point, David asks her what else she wants, and she accidentally points the scanner at him, making for an awkward situation. In the next appointment, Elizabeth and David meet up with a DJ named Joey. He asks them what kind of music they want at the wedding. Joey also mistakes them for a couple, so Elizabeth immediately corrects him. Elizabeth tells Joey that she forgot her list, so he suggests a song for her. Elizabeth and David recognize the song, and they both laugh. She tells him that she should head back to the house to get her list. However, David convinces her to dance with him before heading out. During the dance, David points out that Elizabeth's footing is off, so he tells her to let him lead. They share a romantic moment on the dance floor. Their moment is then interrupted by Joey coming back and asking if they like the song. Elizabeth becomes uncomfortable and leaves, telling David that she'll meet him back at the house. In the next scene, we see Elizabeth thinking out loud while at a restaurant. The waitress reminds her to order so she can take her break. Elizabeth continues talking to herself about the events that transpired that week, about how a lot of things didn't go as planned. The waitress brings back a slice of a pie, even though Elizabeth never finished a platter of oysters. Elizabeth thanks her, and she eats the pie while zoning out. The next day, we see a short but sweet interaction between Louise and Eugene that ends up with her giving him a kiss on the cheek. They have gotten closer than ever. Back at the treehouse, we see Elizabeth struggling to climb the hanging ladder. David arrives to cheer her on. She tells him about her feelings for the past few days. She talks about wanting to step out of her comfort zone, take a break from her daily routine, and finally travel to places with her fiancé. After expressing her plans, she attempts to climb the ladder again and succeeds. In the next scene, we see George back at the clinic talking to Denise. He thanks her for her hard work. Denise expresses her enthusiasm for work, while looking at the dentist with an admiring gaze. Next, we go back to the recreation room and see Elizabeth and David watching an old movie together. Louise enters the room and tells both of them that the bridge is reopening soon. Before they can react, the power cuts out, so David and Elizabeth go to the back of the house to check the fuse box. While David inspects the fuse box, Elizabeth notices the boxes of stuff lying around. She takes a box with David's name on it and looks at its contents. She finds a lot of mementos from David's previous travels. As she takes a look at the items, David recommends that she and George should go to Paris. He also reminds her that it is okay to choose her own happiness, regardless of what others might think. Elizabeth goes silent, then the power lights turn on again, and the two bid each other goodnight. The next day, George returns and meets up with Elizabeth. They go on a short walk together. Elizabeth opens up and tells George that they should travel the world. She tells him that, since they don't have kids yet, it would be the perfect time for them to go on an adventure. She brings up Rome and Paris. George insists that they have no time to be going on trips, since they have a lot of patients to care for and career seminars to attend. Elizabeth doesn't argue further. Instead, she asks George to dance with her. The couple dances awkwardly, and it's obvious that George isn't enthusiastic about it. At one point, George asks if they are done dancing. Then the couple walk back to the house. Later that night, the engagement party is happening, and we see different guests having a good time. Grandma Vivian talks about how back in her day, there was no fancy celebration before a wedding. She brags about being married for 57 years, and points out that the shorter the engagement, the longer a marriage will last. After Vivian leaves the scene, David asks the couple to go on the dance floor with him. George declines, and only Elizabeth joins David for a dance. David takes her hand, preparing to dance. However, the music turns from upbeat to romantic as soon as they hold hands. Once again, they share another romantic moment on the dance floor. The moment is cut short when Diana tells everyone to grab some desserts. David and Elizabeth notice that they are still holding hands, so they slowly let go. Elizabeth approaches her fiancé and tells him that they need to talk. She starts the conversation by telling him a story that resembles her childhood experience. Her story talks about a little girl who was welcomed by another family, and her struggle to replicate the perfect family and the perfect life. George asks Elizabeth what she is trying to say. Elizabeth admits that she wants to go look for herself and find out what really makes her happy without a plan. George asks what that entails for their relationship. Elizabeth gives him the engagement ring back, and that is enough for George to understand what she means. They share one final hug, and Elizabeth thanks George for everything before she leaves the room. When Elizabeth moves to a different room, she overhears Diana and Louise talking about David. She finds out that he already left to go on his next adventure. A year later, we see a sequence of scenes showing different people reading Elizabeth's postcards. She tells them about her adventures in all the places she's been. When Elizabeth arrives back in Seattle, she reads a letter that contains an invitation to Louise and Eugene's wedding. Days later, we see a wedding celebration, and everyone is having a good time. Denise and George are dancing together. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is sitting at a table sipping her drink while watching everyone. David joins her, and he makes a comment about Denise's dance moves. Elizabeth mentions that Denise caught the bouquet. George looks at them, waves, and points at Denise, implying that she and he are in a relationship. Elizabeth tells David that she wanted to write to him, but didn't know where to send the postcards. David then takes her hand, and they walk to a quiet location away from the party. David shows her a note that he wrote when he was 13. It contained all the places he wanted to go to with Elizabeth. David tells her that he put it inside a book, hoping that she would find it. He then confesses to her that he only ever fell in love once, and it was always her that he had feelings for. Elizabeth responds by asking him to dance. Seconds later, they share a heartfelt kiss. At the end of the movie, we see them in the treehouse, watching a movie together.